So you can see here the crowd shot that we'll be constructing in After Effects using Trapcode Particular. We've got a crowd shot filling out the floor here, and then we've got an LED wall in the background, both done with Trapcode Particular. My starting composition looks like this. I've got two solids sort of making a stage, as well as a musician on the stage, and a couple of lights pointing at that musician. Also, I've got a composition that I've made that has some type. It says the word live, and then a simple gray background right behind it. So the first thing I'm going to construct is that LED wall. Let's jump to my camera view here. We'll create a solid for my particular layer, and this will be the LED wall. And let's apply Trapcode Particular. What we're going to be doing is using a layer grid emitter to make that grid of lights in the background. We'll use that live composition as the emitter. And what we'll do is use the lightness to drive the size of the particles. So the gray areas will make smaller particles, and the white area with the type will make larger particles. Now, as you can see, our grid is not nearly big enough. I need to go into the options here and select the grid emitter size, and I'll make this 150x and 50 in the Y. Let's drag the LED wall behind all the other elements. Turn off the transparency grid. Now, it's actually getting pretty close. What we need to do is turn the velocity down so the particles are not traveling from the point in which they are emitted. So let's turn the velocity down to 0. And we can see something that looks pretty close to this LED wall. Now, I'll turn down the size just a little bit. Now, here's where we're going to run into the problem with grid emitters, is that on one frame they can look great, but they can start to flicker as we have not enough particles being emitted with our particles per second setting. Now we can turn up the life of the particle, but what's going to happen is we'll have particles overlapping and turning on and off in place. It's not going to be quite ideal. We really need a very low lifespan that is equal to 1 frame in duration. So I've done this before using the expression. I think that's the easiest way to do this. So if I Alt-click or Option-click on the life here, I can add just a very simple expression. Now, before I used this comp frame duration, which is one way to do it. And that doesn't really take much thought. You can just type that in as is. Just watch the capitalization. In my composition, if I'm working in NTSC, this is going to be about 1/30th of a second. Now, if you don't want to remember that, you could also just type in 1 divided by your frame rate. Like if you're working in PAL, you could just type 1/25th, and that will be equal to 1/25th of a second, or in NTSC, 1 divided by 29.97. I'll leave it like that. This will have the same result. We just want a very short lifespan. So as we learned before, we need a very high particle count, that is the number in the grid, that times our particle count. And this is actually going to exceed the number of particles per second that Particular is even capable of. It's going to be limited to 200,000 particles. So unfortunately, we're still going to see a little bit of flicker here. So the way to compensate for this, first of all, we need to go into the options, turn up the pre-run so we can have particles on the very first frame. And then we'll just freeze this using the physics time factor. So I'll set this here, set a little keyframe, hit U to show my keyframes. I'm going to move forward 1 frame and keyframe that down to 0. So now if I scrub through this, we won't see any flickering or flashing of that background. It's a little bit complicated, but it's just one of those workarounds that you have to keep in mind when working with layer grid emitters. They need an extremely high particle count so that the grid itself does not flicker on and off. because we've exceeded how many particles we can even have. We cannot have over 200,000, so our workaround is just to sort of freeze it in place. Now let's change the color of the particle. We'll set this to kind of a yellow. And to dress this up a little bit, I'll throw a glow filter on here. I'll set this to be based on the alpha channel, and I'll pick a couple of colors to add to this glow. Color is A and B. Turn the threshold down. Like that. That's looking pretty good. So as I move my camera around, this LED wall and the musician will all work together, as well as the stage itself. So now we need to fill out this area down here with a crowd. So for this custom particle image, I'm going to be using a comp image from Ribbit Films. And this is a 5-person crowd shot. And if I use this as a custom particle, I can flood the floor of this stage area and make it look like there is a crowd right in front of the stage using this simple shot right here of 5 people. So I need to drop this piece of footage into my composition and turn off the visibility. Next, let's create a layer for Particular, and this will be the crowd. So apply trap code Particular. And I'm just going to solo this layer for now. So the idea here is that we're going to use a very large emitter. So we'll use a box emitter. And I'm going to turn the velocity down to 0. So the particles are not moving. And I need to turn the emitter size way up. This is going to be a very high value in both X and Z. And we can sort of tweak the location of this box emitter. And I'm going to turn up the particles per second to sort of fill this whole area out with particles. Let's move this crowd shot down just a little bit and unsolo it. So the particles are more or less where the crowd is going to be. So just sort of adjust this into place. So if I move my camera back, we can see that we would have a crowd filling out this whole area. I'll solo this layer again and go into my particle settings and set the particle type to custom. And in the layer here, I'll select the layer, this target file right here. It's going to give you a warning that's saying that the custom particle is very big. Normally you use fairly small custom particles, but in a setting like this where we're creating a crowd shot, this is fine. And it's not going to error, it's just telling you that this might render a little bit slow. So don't worry about it, just hit OK. Wait for it to render. And we've got our crowd in there. Now the size is pretty small, so let's turn this up till we get a fairly realistic looking crowd. And we'll kind of tweak this to taste. I think it's bunched together just a little bit too much here. I'm going to turn the particles per second down until this feels a little more natural. There we go. Now, in my camera here, I can turn on depth of field and enable depth of field in Particular as well. Under here, the render mode, we'll set this to full render plus depth of field smooth. So as the crowd moves away from the camera, the distant crowd is going to be a little bit out of focus. You can see out there, we got a little bit of out of focus area and area in front that's more in focus. Now again, this is a particle generator, so we'll have to keep in mind that we need to adjust the lifespan of these particles so that they sort of don't disappear and pop in and out of the screen. My composition now is 10 seconds in length. If I go into my options here, set the pre-run to 100 and set my particle life to 20 seconds. Again, the pre-run is the percentage of our composition length. So Particular will behave as if it had been generating particles 10 seconds prior to frame 0. So in theory, if I set my particles to 20 seconds, we shouldn't see any disappear throughout the course of the composition. Now, what this means is that we're going to have a lot more particles in here. So the thing to keep in mind when we adjust our particle life, which is going to extend the amount of time we see any given particle on the screen, and we adjust our pre-run to 100%, so it is generating particles before frame 0, this is really going to throw off our particle count. And ultimately what we're going to do is bring this particles per second count way down. I'm going to turn this down to 10, which is a far cry from 400, but turning our particle lifespan up to 20 seconds and turning on the pre-run is really going to throw this off. So we're going to have a drastic change here in terms of how many particles per second we really end up needing. So with a particles per second count of 10, we actually end up with a fairly decent looking crowd shot here. Now, just in case any of these particles decide to turn on or off, what I'm going to do is set the opacity over life to fade up and down. And actually, I'm just going to make a very quick fade up and fade down. Smooth that out a little bit. Now if I turn everything else back on, you can see our crowd shot with the stage and the billboard up front. Got this naturally feeling crowd. It interacts with the camera and the depth of field with the camera and all that. Now one thing we're lacking with Trapcode Particular is any way to control the lighting from one particle to the next. Particles themselves do not react to After Effects lights. So if we want a little bit of lighting variation on this crowd, we're going to have to fake this effect. I'm going to do this by overlaying a black solid on top of the crowd. So I'll create a black solid. We'll just call this lighting. We'll make it a 3D layer and hit R to show the rotation and rotate it 90 degrees in X. Tap S to show the scale, and I'm just going to scale this out so that it fills the crowd. Now, I'm going to put an elliptical mask on this simply by double-clicking the elliptical mask tool there. I'll set this to subtract, and now I can scale this mask in to sort of have a light area and then a dark area outside of the mask. Now, if I double-click on this layer, to show the layer itself, I'm going to split my view here. So I've got my mask here and my final render here. If I double click on one of these points, I'll be able to scale this mask in, and I'm going to hold down Control and Shift so I can scale it in. And let's take a look at the mask feathering here. I'll feather the edge of this mask. And overall, I'm going to move this lighting layer down. I'll hit P to show the position and move its position downward. And I'll move it forward just a little bit like that. So essentially, I can move this mask around and make this become kind of a lighting area for the crowd. So I can move this around and sweep it around and make a sort of spotlight kind of effect wherever I'd like the crowd to be a little bit lighter and a little bit darker outside of this. So I'll close this up, and I'll turn the opacity of this layer down just a little bit so we can see through the areas on the edge here. And it looks like we need to bring this mask down just a little bit more. Make it a little bit smaller. Move it closer to the stage like that. So this will be the lighter area here, and then everything outside of it's going to be just a little bit darker. So again, it's a nice way to sort of create kind of a spotlight effect here in three-dimensional space and work around the shortcoming of the Trapcode particles not actually reacting to After Effects lights. So from here, it's just a matter of animating the camera. So we'll start it here, create a keyframe, and then over the course of 3 seconds, we'll move this in closer to the stage. So I'll move the camera in. I'm also going to move the point of interest forward a little bit. There we go. And we'll select that keyframe and select Easy Ease In. And we'll do a short render of this.